Yo, what's going on, guys? So this is day 7 of the Jazz Vocabulary Challenge, and today I'm gonna look at a line from Kurt Rosenwinkel, and this is from his song "Homage on Mitch." And this song is really cool. I actually kind of want to study more of this song, and I just happened to pick out this one line that I just thought was a cool line, just thinking it was cool, and I actually discovered something really interesting about it that I definitely think is worth sharing. So let me just show you what the line is first. So I'm going to start it as I usually do, a couple seconds before, and I'll point out when the line comes. So here it is. Right now. Okay? So that line, I do it slowly. Okay? Just for the hell of it, let's see if I can actually do it at this speed. I literally just learned this morning. I still need a little bit of practice. But, so this is going to be a quick one, but like I said, I think there's something really good to take out of this. So, I haven't analyzed all of the harmony from this song yet, but as far as this part goes, I'm pretty sure what's happening harmonically is a minor 2-5-1 in the key of C sharp minor. You know, so D sharp. I always like to think things in terms of flats. Like typically this minor, you would call it C sharp minor, but maybe I'll just call it D flat minor, because I always like to think of things in terms of flats. So like E flat half diminished, A flat 7 to D flat minor. Okay? So, here's what we want to take from this. So, the main thing that we're going to be looking at is the beginning of the line, which he's starting with basically 2 diminished arpeggios. This, I kind of see that as like an E diminished starting on the root. I mean, when we're talking about diminished 7, you know, any of them can be considered the root because it's symmetrical, but I'm thinking of this as E diminished, and then, what am I doing? So when he goes there, he's got some other passing tones, but I'm kind of thinking of it as E flat diminished, okay? Now, this is the part I want to focus on, but just before we focus on it, let me just kind of show you the rest of the line, which is a very clear to me outline of D flat minor, which is the one that he is approaching. So when he gets there, okay, so here, so what he's doing, so he's just going down the triad, 5, 3, 1, 5. Then he's doing a little enclosure back to the root. Okay? And then when he gets to the root again, he just ascends the scale, 1, 2, 3, then 5, and then octave, and then going back to there. So just as far as that D flat minor goes playing. Okay? So that, I'm going to, get out of the way. Just want to make sure you can kind of understand that. But the 2-5 is really what we're going to be looking at. Okay? So, here's why I think it's interesting. Those 2 diminished 7th arpeggios, which I'm kind of mainly seeing as E diminished and E flat diminished, you can clearly say that they both come from the same symmetrical diminished scale, which if we thought of the half whole version of it, it would be like E flat half whole diminished. Right? This is also, obviously, if you started on the E, it would be called like the E whole half diminished scale. You know what I mean? But they're the same scale. Okay? So, before I explain why I think that this is really cool, let's just review a little bit of what we might know about diminished scales, okay? Because typically what you learn when you're studying music is, as far as these whole half, or these half-whole symmetrical diminished scales go, say you have a chord that is like a dominant chord, like a 5 going to a 1, alright? And let's make the 5 chord A flat 7, since that is the 5 chord in this example that we're talking about. Okay? Typically, if you have a dominant chord, it's known that the diminished scale that you play starting on the root of the dominant chord would be the half whole. Meaning that if in that context, if we wanted to use what we traditionally use with this half whole scale, it would be an A flat half whole diminished scale. Right? So that's what we're used to hearing. Okay? And then in place of where you would use the whole half diminished scale would be if the chord in the music was actually a diminished scale, so if you had something like doing like a passing diminished chord, like over something like that. I'm just kind of showing you in context, but that's typically where you use the whole half diminished scale is over like that. You'd start that on the root of the actual diminished chord. But like I said, the diminished and the dominant are related. But here's what is really interesting, okay? If we think of, because in this context we have the dominant chord A flat 7, so you would think that the scale, the diminished scale that we would be using would be one of the roots of that, like either A flat or B or D or F, because that would be the root of the whole half scale that we'll be using. But obviously that's not the scale that he's using here. He's using a half whole scale that starts on E flat. So just to kind of show you, that also, because it's symmetrical, is the same thing as C half whole or A half whole or F sharp half whole, okay? So the thing that we can take from this is that there's other diminished scales, half whole diminished scales, that you can use over the context of a dominant chord other than the one that starts on the root of the dominant chord and the ones that are symmetrically related to it, okay? And not that you need to necessarily know like why it works or how it could relate, but to me, and again, this is just based off of my thoughts of just putting this a couple of hours of thought into this because I just learned this today. The interesting thing is this: if we compare those two scales, so if we look at like say the A flat half whole diminished scale and the E flat half whole diminished scale, one thing that you'll find is that they both have the note A in them. And here, that's the thing, because you can build a diminished chord off of any degree of a symmetrical diminished scale. That's why any symmetrical diminished scale that you have, you always find like two diminished seventh arpeggios that are back to back. That's why, like in the case of this, we had the E diminished scale or arpeggio and the E flat, because those are the two that are built. It makes sense, because if we started on E flat with the half whole, that would be the first degree of the scale that we can build diminished arpeggio off of, and then we go up a half step, we're at E, so obviously there's another diminished arpeggio built off of that, okay? But the thing is, with E flat diminished, one of the diminished chords that is the same thing that relates to that is A diminished, okay? So A diminished is actually in both of these scales, okay? And if we were to name it like this, basically, in the normal function, A diminished would be played as a whole half diminished scale. But in the version that he's using, A diminished is coming from an A half whole diminished scale, okay? So that's basically what it is. And to kind of show you like what I mean, like if we can kind of compare and contrast things, now you can kind of use this little diminished pattern in any degree that it works on and it'll still work. In terms of how I resolve it to D flat minor, you kind of just have to know how to resolve it. So to show you what I mean, say, because again, we're thinking of this like if I thought of this scale as E flat half whole diminished, we're thinking of the diminished arpeggios that are on the root of that and a half step up, which is E. So if we thought of A half whole diminished, which is what it normally is, we can think of, A diminished, A flat diminished and A diminished. So I can do a same or a similar type of line where I'm going, right? And obviously that works too. So look how I'm using two different diminished scales, and I mean the line is, it's basically the same line transposed, but it's literally in a different key, and it's not like just like down or up a minor third, which is, because that would be like a symmetrical thing, meaning like obviously if we have E flat that we're thinking, we can do the same thing from any of the other symmetrical degrees of that scale. So we can take this and obviously move it down down minor thirds. You gotta know how to resolve it. Or I can do it over here. Or I can do it over here. That didn't sound like good. That works. But again, that's not what the traditional diminished scale is when you typically play half-whole diminished scales on the root of the dominant chord. So if we were to use that, or I can play it at that degree. I can play it over here. Let's see, how about over here? I can play it over here. So now, like with this example, because this is actually related to the traditional diminished scale, now instead of starting on E diminished, I'm starting on E flat diminished. You know what I mean? So I'm just kind of on the fly trying to figure out how to resolve these. But like I said, I think that this is a really good thing to actually take, because normally that is not the half-whole diminished scale or any of the symmetrical degrees that you use over a dominant chord. Okay? So this was awesome, because now I found a different diminished scale that is in a different key that I can use over a dominant chord. And a good way to think of it, because if you want to see, like, I thought of it as E flat, because it's a minor 2-5-1, but I'm kind of just simplifying my thinking to just thinking about the 5, which is A flat 7. That's another thing, by the way, is that the first chord, if it's E flat diminished, I'm actually playing E diminished over E flat half diminished. So maybe it kind of relates in a way like that. But if we just think A flat 7, again, I thought of the half-whole scale E flat, which is up a fifth. But again, we can look at anything that relates to that. So you can also use the half-whole diminished scale that is a half step above the root of the dominant chord. So that's something they can use. So again, if you have like a flat dominant 7 chord, you can think where normally you would use A flat half-whole diminished, you can use A half-whole diminished. So I don't know how many times I said diminished and half-whole in that, but that shouldn't have been too hard to follow along with, and hopefully that inspires you to get some new use out of the diminished scales if you weren't already aware of this. And again, why does this work? For one main reason only, because it sounds good. And that's the most important thing. If it sounds good and it makes sense, then it is good. And again, it's clear as day. If you think of that, it works so well. So that's all the justification you need. So I hope that you enjoyed that, and I'll see you tomorrow.